Okay, welcome everyone to The Whole Itself Remains. I'm your host, Todd Caldecott, and you're listening to CJMP, Co-op Radio 90.1 FM, broadcasting from the Qathet region on the beautiful Sunshine Coast of British Columbia on the traditional territory of the Cl.H people. So this show is part of a weekly Q&A series that subscribers can join me each Wednesday to explore health, healing, and human wholeness. And after the broadcast, we will dive deeper into a 30 to 60 minute Q&A where subscribers can ask me anything, whether clinical, personal, or philosophical. And if you're tuning in on CJMP or watching later on YouTube and you want to join this live conversation, stay with me and I'll explain how to subscribe at the end of the show. Okay, so it's been a busy week for me. I'm just getting ready amidst all of the activities here on our little farm. Springtime means that there's just always so much stuff to do. So much weeding needs to be done. The lawn needs to be cut like every week. I've got a bunch of starts that I'm slowly rotating out into the garden and just getting ready in that regard. And of course, I'm heading off to Toronto tomorrow to speak at the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition's 17th annual symposium on nutrition. So it's going to be a little bit of a whirlwind tour for me, but I'm looking forward to getting out there. And today's also been busy. I've been making medicine in the background here and coordinating a few other things, just getting ready. So a little bit of a hectic time in my life. That just seems to be the nature of spring, doesn't it? Just everything begins to unfold at once, and it's just sometimes a struggle just to keep up with everything. So if you're feeling the same, you have my sympathies. Just last weekend, I went out to speak with or interview Karsten Huber. He's a natural homes builder. And so we've got the footage and the recording, and we're going to work on editing that and then having that available for the next show. Karsten is a master carpenter and has been building natural homes from this sort of holistic perspective for many decades. And he's got some really interesting perspectives to share on that. And I've also secured an interview coming up in the next few weeks with a fellow named Rob Hughes who specializes in men's work. He has a men's group here that includes folks that are both aligned or part of the Indigenous community, the Cl.H community, as well as other folks. And I want to speak to him specifically. I'm interested in the subject of masculinity and discussing this idea if men are in crisis. I think men are. I think that men have been struggling for some time. I think there are many ways in which the current educational environment doesn't meet the needs of boys. I was one of those little boys that was constantly getting into trouble because the classroom environment just simply didn't work for me, and it had nothing to do with my intelligence. It had to do with format. And I'm pretty sure that I would have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder and perhaps put on medications like Ritalin. But it was so long ago that I just got detention or sent to the principal's office, which usually was like once a week. And, I know there's a lot of sensitivity out there to men's issues, and there's certainly some pushback as well to talking about or phrasing the issue like it is a crisis. But my perspective as a man, someone who's quite happy to be a heterosexual male, I've observed that men have been in crisis for some time. I spoke a little bit about my experience in school growing up, but also the ways in which men are able to create and support relationships and friendships throughout their lifetime. Increasingly, we're seeing that young men in particular are lonely. They're disconnected. I think it isn't exclusive only to men. I think many women are also in that same category. But I think the issue is hitting harder for men. And I think this has a lot to do with the way the male brain works as opposed to the female brain. And of course, I don't want to overgeneralize because our brains and the way they develop, the way they're formed, occurs across a spectrum between polar opposites of male and female. And so you might find yourself somewhere on that spectrum. That's where we kind of get this notion of gender. And if it's kind of an ideal situation, then the gender of your brain matches exactly that of your body. But we know that both biologically as well as psychologically, that our experience of gender occurs on a spectrum. And it really seems that men are getting siloed or compartmentalized into some version of like a hypermasculinity, which has always been kind of a trend, I guess, among men throughout the evolution of humanity. Where there's this ideal of being a very masculine man, big muscles and hairy and, so-called alpha dominant like behavior. But we also know that, from that perspective, men have been the source of so much social problems here on Earth. I mean, if you think about all of the conflicts and wars, it's not women typically that are causing them. I mean, not to say that they're not a part of it, but typically the conflicts themselves are driven by this hyper-masculinity, where the only solution ends up being violence. And I think this is a reason why we have for a long time had militaries. It's not simply been a function of protecting the country. It's been about what to do with all the young men and how to give them the support, the discipline they need to be effective men, to cultivate the characteristics and qualities of what it means to be a mature, civilized human, a human male. And so I want to talk to Rob about this and maybe explore a little bit about the neurophysiology of what it means to be a man, and then practically speaking, what are the issues that men are confronting, and how can we look at it from a holistic perspective to bring men back into a sense of alignment with themselves, alignment with their community, alignment with what I think is the primary purpose of what it means to be a man, which is essentially to be a protector. And how can we create an environment that supports that, but in a healthy, balanced way, so that it doesn't spill over and cause these myriad number of social problems. I think fundamentally the issue that we're dealing with is a disconnection from nature and this broader issue of loneliness. And that's something I wanted to talk a little bit about today as well. So, I've talked a little bit about the origin of holism and how we can approach it and incorporate it as a theory, as a practice. The last two episodes I reviewed some health issues, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and then perimenopause. And I did that because I jumped right into those issues because there was a request that I did that. But I want to step back today and maybe look at things more broadly and look at the issue of our connection to life and lifestyle, how we establish a healthy daily rhythm for ourselves, and what are the factors that support that. And much of this today is going to be from the lens of Ayurveda. Because Ayurveda is this classical system of healing from India. It is the oldest continuously practiced system of medicine on earth. And there's really just so much knowledge that Ayurveda has to offer, knowledge that predates modern Western science, that had a very sophisticated approach to health and healing, included certain things like surgery, which we might think of as being strictly a modern, Western phenomena. In fact, when the English colonized India, they were very surprised to find a bunch of Ayurvedic Indian physicians that were practicing some fairly sophisticated surgeries. In fact, the technique of rhinoplasty, of like a nose job, plastic surgery, came from India. And of course, it wasn't used thousands of years ago to reshape someone's nose because it was aesthetically unpleasing. It was mostly to address issues like an accident or trauma and how to restore the integrity and function of whatever tissue, in this case the nose. This is a technique that was learned by European physicians from these Ayurvedic Indian physicians. And so Ayurveda has a long history of very sophisticated practices that included surgery. Maybe one day I'll get into talking about that in more detail. It's a fascinating subject, how this system of medicine that's primarily based on using herbal remedies had this sophisticated approach to things like surgery. Abdominal surgeries, even certain forms of brain surgery were practiced thousands of years ago in India. And it's underappreciated. So Ayurveda has a wealth of knowledge to offer us. And in many respects, I consider it to be kind of the mother of all these different healing systems that we engage with today. Not to co-opt these other systems. So we have these indigenous systems of practice that are found in the Americas, that are found in Africa. It's not to say that their practice came from Ayurveda, but that there's a lot in common with Ayurveda in terms of the theory and practice, but they're just not as, say, systematized and sophisticated as Ayurveda. So Ayurveda is the oldest continuously practiced system of medicine on earth. And the other lovely thing, speaking particularly as a Westerner, as a white guy, who is fascinated with Ayurveda, is that the principles and practices can be applied to anyone, no matter where you live. And that's one interesting perspective that I also want to discuss today, that if you are practicing or interested in practicing aspects of Ayurveda, incorporating them into your lifestyle, it doesn't need to be only from like an Indian basis. If you live in Canada, then you need to live in the environment in which you live and seek out influences which balance the factors of your life here in Canada. And that doesn't mean just wholesale borrowing everything that's Indian and trying to fit it into your lifestyle here. It means being inspired by those practices, learning from those practices, finding those things which are sustainable and weaving them into your life here. But you have to acknowledge where you are in your life now, what part of the world that you live in, what are the sociocultural influences, what are the dietary influences, climatic, geological influences of the current environment in which you live, and to make sure that those, the teachings of Ayurveda are then moderated by those different factors. So it's a really important aspect, and it's in large part what I've devoted my life to, because although I'm fascinated with Ayurveda, it's at the same time I have to recognize my own background and where I live, aren't in complete alignment with Indian culture. And that doesn't mean anything except that we just need to adapt those teachings, those practices to the time and place in which we live. And so that's what I want to focus on a little bit today and talk about, and how we can incorporate these Ayurvedic practices into our daily lives. So Ayurveda is concerned with this concept of dharma. The root is dhr. It means to support or uphold. And it refers to the natural rhythm of life. So you might think in some context, dharma, if you're a Hindu or a Buddhist, it refers to the teachings of those different religions or faiths. In the context of Ayurveda, dharma means to support and uphold the natural rhythm of life. Like, we don't have to do anything for the sun to rise every morning and to set every evening. We don't have to do anything for the seasonal changes to take place, the transition from spring to summer, from summer to fall, from fall to winter, winter to spring. These happen regardless of whatever influence that we have. And it is the fact that these are continuously unfolding is an expression of this concept of dharma. Because all these natural rhythms and cycles, the way they're coordinated has given rise to life here on earth, in a very particular form in which life manifests. And Ayurveda suggests that we want to align ourselves with these natural rhythms and cycles to remove obstructions that might otherwise be causing problems. And one of the big characteristics of our modern Western lifestyle is how disconnected it is from these natural rhythms and cycles. And according to Ayurveda, this is a really important causative factor in disease. If we don't align ourselves with these natural rhythms and cycles, then we're just fighting against the current. And we want to work in concert with this flow. It creates an ease of flow. It creates an ease of life when we're aligned with these natural rhythms and cycles. And so let's talk a little bit about that today. So according to Ayurveda, there's 3 components of lifestyle, and I'm not going to get into all of them today. Dinacharya, Sadvrita, and Ritucharya. So let's just briefly talk about what they are. So dinacharya, this is a word which means the daily regimen. Dina, daily, charya, regimen. It also could be interpreted to mean acharya as in following, so following the day. Dinacharya, to follow the day. So as I referred to earlier, that we're here on earth, we are participating in a product of these natural rhythms and cycles, and Ayurveda suggests through this practice of dinacharya that we align ourselves with those rhythms. We follow the different changes. We seek inspiration from those changes to remove obstructions and blockages from our life. So by incorporating this practice of dinacharya, we align ourselves to this natural rhythm. And the result is that we can obtain good health and wellness. Sadvita, which I'm not going to get into much today, refers to like a moral code. So Sat literally means truth, and Vrita means to set in motion. So it is the kind of the core morality that we follow to ensure that we are expressing this fundamental truth of life, and that it is set in motion such that others benefit, we benefit, and that once again we find ourselves in alignment with this natural flow. And then Ritucharya refers to the seasonal regimen. Ritu means season, and then acharya means, once again, regimen. So it's the seasonal regimen. And once again, we're not going to be able to get into this in any great detail today. There just simply isn't enough time, but maybe we'll do this for another session where we can talk about the influence of the different seasons of spring, summer, fall, winter, and how we can make adaptations so that we can, once again, live in alignment with these changes, in harmony with these changes, which means that we can best support our health. So according to Ayurveda, in the context of dinacharya, there are 3 pillars that support life. This is called the Traya Upastamba, and they consist of 3 components: diet, sleep, and sexual activity. So, as an adult, these are sort of 3 primary supports of life that are present, that all must remain in balance. So if we eat too much food, have too much sleep, or engage in too much sex, they all weaken or disrupt the function of the body. And likewise, too little food, too little sleep, too little sex also creates imbalances. So it's important that we remain judicious in our interaction with these different supports of life. That we get the right amount of food, that we get the right amount of sleep, that we have the right amount of intimacy. Now, traditionally in the context of Ayurveda, sometimes this last element of sexual activity refers to brahmacharya or celibacy, because it's thought that in the expression of sexuality that we release this life force called ojas. Obviously sex is a biological function for the reproduction of the species, and so there's something that is given to the process of sexual intercourse. Here we're talking specifically of heterosexual couples, but there's something that's given to the process of oneself to generate and support life. And this is thought to deplete or rob the body of some degree of its vital essence. Now, I think that can be overstated. I think there could be an excess worry or concern or fear about that, and I don't want to trap any of you into sort of an imbalanced thinking about sexuality, that you need to be obsessed about retaining your sexual fluids, as it were, to support your health. But nonetheless, what Ayurveda is cautioning is that there needs to be a healthy expression of sexuality. And if we think about sexuality as it relates to pleasure and desire, it really kind of opens up the notion of desire more generally. So having a healthy relationship with desire. Obviously, we're driven by desire as a species, as individuals. When we're hungry, we desire food. When we're lonely, we desire intimacy. When we are tired, we desire sleep. And those are natural biological functions that need to be served. But when our relationship with those desires is imbalanced, then it begins to create problems. Right? So then you end up eating too much food, or you sleep too long, or once again you're just kind of obsessed with sexual expression. And I think that's relevant in the context of what we were talking about earlier, in particular with men. For example, in things like pornography, which has become, I think, something of a social issue. By no means am I have a negative perspective on sex. I think, as per Ayurveda, sexuality is a normal, healthy expression of what it means to be human. But at the same time, I think we can all see that there's potential problems with things like pornography and its availability in the digital landscape, and how that's kind of disrupting things like normal human intimacy. In particular, seems to be targeting men, young men in particular, such that it is more and more difficult for young men to develop a sense of healthy sexuality, because it's being influenced by this pornographic representation of what intimacy is. And once again, there's nothing wrong per se with pornography, but in the way in which it is being consumed and promulgated, and the way in which it is disrupting normal human intimacy and sexual relations, creating unrealistic expectations about sexuality, about relationship. I think these are all really important issues that need to be addressed. So I think you can see how it is an important issue for us to look at. And it's not an either or issue. It's something that we need to look at holistically. And so maybe that's something that we'll be talking about in future episodes. But nonetheless, this is what Ayurveda is saying, is that we need to make sure we have these three elements, the Traya Upastamba, in a state of balance. Now, when we talk about the daily regimen in Ayurveda, there is a natural flow. As I mentioned, with the rising and setting of the sun, there is a cyclical flow that occurs during the day and also during the night when the sun sets. And according to Ayurveda, these are regulated by the three doshas of Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And we think of doshas as relating to characteristics of the body. They also can be associated with different eliminatory functions. Like when you use the term Vata, it can also be translated as gas or fart. Pitta as bile, and Kapha as mucus. So they have like very particular designations or relationships with the physical body and its various excretions. But the three doshas also represent this dynamic of cyclical change. So everything has its beginning in Kapha, everything has its flowering in Pitta, and everything has its end within Vata. So you might be familiar with this concept from Hinduism of the Trimurti, of the three gods of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer. These can also be related to these three doshas. So Brahma is the creator, and that relates to Kapha. Vishnu is the preserver, that relates to Pitta. And then Shiva is the destroyer, and that relates to Vata. And so this refers to a cyclical change. So the day always begins with Kapha, and as the sun rises and achieves its zenith in the middle of the day, this is the Pitta time of day. And then as the sun begins to set towards the horizon, this is the end of the day. This is the Vata time of day. And that cyclical change also occurs within our lives. So we're all more Kapha as little babies. And as we get older, we become progressively more Pitta in nature. And then as we get older, we become progressively more Vata. So it's this cycle of growth, maintenance, and degeneration. And that occurs within the period of a day. right? So what Ayurveda says is that ideally you want to make sure that you wake up in the morning in the period just before the creation of the day. So just imagine like that if you didn't know that the earth rotated around the sun, and you just had this very kind of simple primeval understanding, then you bear witness to the sun rising every morning. I mean, where did it go? It just comes up like the world gets created again every day with the rising of the sun. And Ayurveda says that we want to bear witness to this experience. And so ideally we want to be awake and engaged for the rising of the sun. Ayurveda calls this the Brahma Muhurta. It's the time of Brahma, to bear witness to the creation of the day. If you think about it, it's like a miraculous event that happens. Formerly, there was no light, it was dark, there was nothing, and then there's this rising of the sun to mark a new day, a new cycle of change. So the day gets created out of this quality of Brahma, the god of creation. And Ayurveda says we want to bear witness to that. And so in order to do that, we get up just before the sun rises. Now, in a northern temperate climate, that can mean that you're getting up awfully early. And that's not necessarily practical for everyone to do. We want to be practical. But getting up early is a wise idea, according to Ayurveda, because what it does is that it helps to align our bodies with this natural rhythm. Consider the fact that our ancient ancestors, who didn't have the benefit of modern conveniences like electricity, they got up with the sun because they needed to make the most of the light, right? Like, what are you just going to burn fires all night and candles just so you can stay up and, do stuff? No. People went to bed, they went to sleep, they rested. But then they got up early so that they could take advantage of the light. And of course, the light was just the increasing light suppresses the synthesis and release of melatonin, activates serotonin, and so naturally we're going to be awake at this time, right? If you've ever gone camping, you might have had that experience. You go to bed relatively early, and then it gets light really early, and you can hear the birds. And you don't have blackout curtains. You're not in this insulated home. The day is underway and you're a part of that, so you just wake up. So Ayurveda says it's important. And if you get up during this Brahma Muhurta, the beginning part of the day, then you align yourself with this natural rhythm and cycle. And then many of the cyclical changes that occur in the body also begin to flow unencumbered. For example, like the elimination of wastes, or just how you feel. There's a lot of research and interest these days in modulating serotonin and how it affects the circadian cycle and things like your mood. And there's other folks recommending that in the morning, first thing, you get outside and you expose your face, your eyes to this increasing influence of light. And that naturally helps to support the increase of serotonin, which is associated with feeling good and feeling active and feeling like you want to get stuff done. And contrast that with like sleeping through that period. You get up maybe like 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun's already up, and you wake up, according to Ayurveda, during this time of kapha, this time of heaviness. So you wake up at 10 o'clock in the morning and you have this feeling of heaviness and congestion. And when resorted to on a regular basis, that quality of congestion and heaviness begins to dominate your experience. So getting up during the early morning helps to align yourself with this natural rhythm and cycle and can resolve problems like, for example, eliminatory issues like constipation or anxiety and depression. Just getting up early can help to resolve those issues. So, we seek inspiration from this natural flow of the day and honoring those changes like our ancient ancestors would have. And this can bring about a greater, not just awareness of health, but a greater experience of health and wellness. Now, apart from that, when we look at these changes, the beginning part of the day is kapha, the middle is pitta, and the end of the day is vata. If you have a recurring set of issues that occurs at a particular time during this daily cycle. Like, for example, if you are always getting, say, gas and bloating like around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's the vata time of day, that's a vata symptom, then you know that the issue is probably related to vata. So understanding the cyclical changes of the day and what symptoms arise that come and go during that cyclical change can give you some information about what its origin is and how to address it as per Ayurveda. And just like the beginning of the day relates to kapha, when the sun sets, the beginning of the night, this is the kapha time of night. And isn't it interesting that kapha relates to this quality of heaviness? And typically when the sun sets, usually by mid-evening, most people feel naturally tired. If you're watching TV, you start to yawn or something and you feel kind of low energy. And typically if you go to bed around that time, you go to bed by 9 or 10 o'clock at night, you're going to bed during this kapha time, it is a lot easier to fall asleep during that time. But if you stay up too late, if you stay up towards midnight, this is the pitta time of night. And pitta relates to the qualities of heat and activity and dynamism. So if you stay up until midnight, 1 o'clock consistently, you're not going to get the kind of restorative sleep that you need. And it's more likely that you're going to be stoking or activating the latent fires of the mind. And that's going to create a cycle of dysregulation. Then, of course, what happens is that you sleep through the morning and then you wake up late into the kapha time of the morning, have all this heaviness. It takes so much time to burn off that heaviness and congestion such that everything shifts later and later. And then you end up staying up later and later and you're kind of caught in this cycle, the so-called cycle of like a night owl. There's been some research on this this notion of the chronotype of the night owl, and I don't buy it. I don't believe that there's any such thing, these biologically determined, that relates to being a night owl. I definitely know there are people out there that are night owls, but it is an artifact of our modern electrified lifestyle. That in traditional societies that don't have access to electricity, there's no such thing as a night owl. A really interesting little tidbit here, that when my son was 13 years old, I took him with me to Nepal, and he ended up living for 5 weeks in a village that didn't really have any electricity. Certainly didn't have electricity at night. They're farmers, they're laborers. It's a very simple, rudimentary lifestyle. And by 6 o'clock when the sun is setting, they have finished dinner and cleaned up. And they take out a 20 rupee candle because there's no electricity, and they light that candle, and then they sit around the candle and they talk and they laugh, they joke, but illuminated just with a simple candle. Usually within an hour or two, people are starting to yawn and feel tired, such that by around 8:30, everyone is going to bed. And my son, who was convinced he was a night owl, I used to tell him to go to bed. I would turn off his light when he was back home here in Canada. I'd say, okay, time to go to bed. It's 10:30. I would go upstairs, and of course, click, the light would come back on, and he would stay up late and always be so difficult to wake up in the morning. He was trying to convince me that he was a night owl, but living in the village in Nepal and following this lifestyle, not having the benefit or the detriment of electricity, this dynamic of being a night owl resolved in a very short period of time, and he no longer was. So I don't buy this notion that there's a chronotype called the night owl. I think it's an artifact of our modern Western lifestyle. And that's important for us to regard, because it's very easy to slip into a dysfunctional living pattern based on these modern influences and not even be aware of what's happening. There's so many unintended consequences of the technology that we engage with that we don't fully consider how it affects things like the daily rhythm, the daily cycle. And that ends up having some really significant or causing some really significant issues for our mental health and wellness and physical health, and that we need to regard. So let's talk about some of these patterns that we can follow. And of course, there's so many when we talk about dinacharya in Ayurveda, there's a long list of practices, and we simply don't have time to engage and discuss all of those today. So I just want to talk about a few of them. So I mentioned that getting up during the Brahma Muhurta, this is the time just before the sun rises. It's considered to be the best time for receiving Brahman. Brahman is like spiritual inspiration. So it's a time when it's the best time of day to study or to meditate, to engage in contemplation, because it's like you're aligning yourself with this recreation of the day. It is aligning yourself with this capacity, this opportunity to recreate yourself every day by aligning with that rhythm. So it's the best time for study and meditation. And when you get up just before the sun rises, you ensure that you don't accumulate a bunch of qathet or heaviness during that time. And a good example of qathet, because remember, qathet also can be translated as mucus and congestion, that you get up just before the sun rises, then the mucus that naturally accumulates, the congestion that naturally accumulates as we sleep, because we're lying there sedentary, not moving, we're sleeping, it creates this heavy quality in the body, that if you get up before the sun rises, then these qualities are naturally shed by the body. And getting up during that time helps to promote the elimination of wastes and then the proper regulation of appetite. And then, of course, if you get up early enough, then it's much more likely that towards the end of the day that you're going to be getting to bed at a reasonable time, instead of everything shifting forward such that you're staying up too late and then really struggling in the morning to wake up. And then when you do wake up, you just feel awful. So one of the key benefits of waking up early in the morning, I've seen it many times, is that it naturally supports the evacuation of wastes. Most of us have that experience. We get up in the morning and then, we go to the bathroom, we pee, we eliminate it. And what Ayurveda suggests is that after you do that, go into the kitchen and then pour yourself a big glass of water. Ayurveda suggests a measurement of 1 prasta. This is about 750 ml of room temperature water. You drink that first thing in the morning. You can put various different things in that water. You could put a squeeze of lemon. You could put a little pinch of rock salt. You can even add some ginger juice to that. Like you can grate some ginger and squeeze a little bit of ginger in there. And so those are different things that you can do to modulate the effect of the water, to help activate the digestion, to stimulate the appetite, to shed the accumulation of mucus and congestion. Those are all helpful. But just getting up in the morning and drinking all this water, it stretches out your stomach and it stimulates this peristaltic flow, which helps to promote the elimination of wastes. So it helps you to have a good, healthy poop in the morning. It also helps to regulate the function of the bladder. This is a key little thing that I mentioned for many folks that have issues with nocturia, which is peeing at night, or feeling like they are peeing too frequently throughout the day. There's this sort of phenomenon that can happen in a relatively mild degree, all the way to say something like interstitial cystitis, where the bladder doesn't need to fill up with very much urine before you have this urge to urinate. And so the bladder becomes kind of hypersensitive to bladder filling and doesn't allow itself to be completely filled with fluid before you get that urge to urinate. That can be a drag. You have to go to the bathroom multiple times in the day, and then you're only excreting a little bit of urine. So this is a really simple way to retrain the bladder. First thing in the morning, you drink a whole bunch of water. It goes into your body, goes through your kidneys, and fills up your bladder. And then your bladder stretches out to accommodate all of that urine that you've just produced by drinking this water. And then you have this urge to urinate, and then the bladder compresses upon itself and you eliminate all that urine. So every morning you're stretching out the bladder and then eliminating that urine. And by stretching out that bladder first thing in the morning, you're decreasing its sensitivity to being filled and increasing its ability to accommodate urine. And so really good for people that have this issue of peeing frequently. Also, as I said, helps to initiate peristalsis. So this is intestinal movement. So it's a really useful thing that you can do just to help with the proper elimination or excretion of wastes. And of course, there's lots of things we can talk about in managing constipation, or say your issue is diarrhea. We talked about some of these things in SIBO. There's things that you can consume, like live culture probiotic foods. A lot of us don't appreciate that 80% by volume of your feces is bacteria. So if you're not eliminating correctly, then it points to typically some problem with the microbiome itself. Maybe you've got some dysbiosis there, you've got too much fungi growing there, or you're not eating enough fiber. That's the prebiotic components of the diet that feed the probiotic bacteria. So that's an important component as well, making sure you're consuming enough of the dietary fiber. And then adding to that these probiotic foods, things like lacto-fermented sauerkraut, lacto-fermented pickles, along with those prebiotic fibers throughout the day in your diet will help to support the production of a healthy bowel movement. But of course, the other thing that's really important, and especially as people get older, is they get dry, right? That's the encroaching influence of Vata. One of the characteristics of Vata is that it's dry in nature, opposite to that of Kapha, which is heavy and greasy. We all have those qualities when we're young, but as we get older, we lose those qualities. They burn off under the influence of Pitta, such that by the end of our life, we get more and more dry. And so hydrating the body, adding those electrolytes that I mentioned, like that little bit of lemon, a little bit of salt, rock salt, for example, helps to hydrate the body and therefore ensure proper elimination. So that's a little simple trick. And then if there's some additional problems with constipation, there's lots of different herbs that we can use for this purpose. Herbs to strengthen the digestive fire. These might be herbs that we would use in Chinese medicine to strengthen the spleen qi, as well as herbs that might be used to moisten the bowel for someone who's older. So the herbs like, for example, like the Indian herb shatavari, or another Chinese herb, mai min dong, Ophiopogon japonicus is helpful. Marshmallow root is another one that's helpful. And we combine those herbs that help to strengthen the digestive fire. So herbs like astragalus root, for example, or another Chinese herb, baiju, is very good for this too. The classic formula that's used in Ayurveda to promote healthy BMs is something called triphala powder, or churna, triphala churna. Churna is the Indian word for powder, Sanskrit word rather. And it's comprised of equal parts haritaki, amalaki, and bibitaki. And you can take this in a few different ways, but you can take it before you go to bed at night. Take 1 large teaspoon, mix it in some water, and then consume that. Or another way you can do it is to mix that before you go to bed at night. That big teaspoon in a little bit of water and a few ounces of water. Let that sit overnight. Next morning, mix it up again. Let all the dregs of that powder settle, and then just drink the fluid, and then discard whatever's remaining at the bottom of the glass. And then if it's a chronic problem with constipation, clean out the glass, measure another dosage of the triphala, add a few ounces of water, stir it up, and then let that sit aside all day, and then consume that before you go to bed. Now, if you take the triphala before you go to bed, it's going to have a milder influence. If you take it when you wake up in the morning, it's going to have a stronger influence. So for most people, I usually say, if you're going to try the triphala, take it before you go to bed at night. And hopefully that will be sufficient. But if you need a stronger effect, you can always take it again in the morning as well. And triphala doesn't work for everyone. It's very good at stimulating the bowel. It's very good for digestion and elimination, but it is a little bit drying in nature. So if your problem is dryness, if that's why you're not able to eliminate properly because you have too much dryness, then you might combine the triphala with herbs like marshmallow root or shatavari or licorice root to moisten it up, or just find another approach altogether that addresses that quality of dryness with some of those herbs that I mentioned, like marshmallow or slippery elm. Attention to prebiotic fibers and probiotic organisms, hydrating regularly, eating lots of soupy foods, and especially avoiding drying foods like things like tortilla chips and lots of popcorn, and just dry foods. Just eliminate those foods in favor of foods which are moistening. Steamed veggies and soup, those types of food are very good for hydrating the body, as well as just making sure you're consuming enough water. And then next thing that's typically undertaken after you have attended to the evacuation of wastes is to clean the mouth. And this is a subject I could probably spend a whole episode talking about. Ayurveda has a very sophisticated approach to cleaning the mouth. It's more than just sticking on some saccharine sweet toothpaste and rubbing it around the teeth for a little while. There's a whole approach to traditional practices of oral care. And there's 4 of them that are used in Ayurveda. The first one, cleaning the tongue, jiva nirlekana. Lekana means like to pull or to remove. So you take a tongue scraper, stick out your tongue, and then pull it across the length of your tongue and remove all that mucus and congestion. Now this has a number of benefits. Not only does it clean the tongue and it removes all that bacteria that accumulated overnight, all that slime and goo, it has a benefit of stimulating the digestion and appetite. Because according to Ayurveda, everything is interconnected. So the tongue is connected to the entire digestive tract. And the tongue itself is considered to be a map of the digestive tract. So when you draw the scraper across the surface of the tongue and you pull all of this mucus off your tongue, you are stimulating the digestive tract. And that sets you up for having a good day of good digestion and good bowel health, good elimination, etc. So cleaning the tongue. And that increasingly is something that's being incorporated into modern dental hygiene. But that's something that has been practiced in Ayurveda for thousands of years. The next technique is called gandusha. So gandusha is filling the mouth with some type of substance. Typically it's oil. You might have heard of it as oil pulling. It's sort of a combination oil pulling of something called gandusha and kavalagraha, or an oral rinse. But it's this idea of taking something like coconut oil or sesame oil, putting it in your mouth and holding it and or swishing it around your mouth before spitting it out. Now, there's some pretty silly stuff out there on the internet about this particular technique, and I do want to suggest that you follow it correctly. Some guy, I can't remember his name, wrote a book on oil pulling, and it's sort of percolated through social media. This idea that you need to practice oil pulling for 20 minutes at a time. That's ridiculous. Nobody does that traditionally, and it doesn't make any sense. You just need to swish the oil or hold the oil in your mouth for a few minutes before you spit it out. Now, what are the benefits of doing that? Well, the oil itself has some antimicrobial properties. And unlike aqueous or water-based substances, that oil is able to penetrate into the gum line, into the gum tissue itself, and pull out different wastes, toxins, bacterial pathogens into the oil before you spit them out. So it's a really good practice to get into, this practice of gandusha or kavalagraha. And then that is followed by danta dhavana, or cleaning the teeth. And traditionally what is used in India are the branches of different medicinal trees. For example, like the neem tree or the pipal tree. This is also the banyan tree. You can break off little sticks, little twigs off the banyan tree, and then you gnaw on the end of the stick, and then once it's kind of frayed, you use that stick essentially as a toothbrush. Now, you don't have to do that. You can use a toothpaste or something. Note that you're not using a plastic bristle brush. There's no microparticle plastics that are involved in this process that you're going to unintentionally ingest. So what you can do instead, what is practiced in Ayurveda, is use a tooth powder. And you can make your own. I have recipes I can share with you. Or you can find them online from different Ayurvedic manufacturers. Danta dhavana is tooth powder, and you just pour some into the palm of your hand. You moisten your finger, dip it in the powder, and then you take your finger and then you use your finger as a toothbrush, and you go through every tooth just rubbing it with this tooth powder. And the tooth powder, some of the herbs that I mentioned, like neem, pipal tree, we have equivalents here. You could use herbs like bayberry is one really good herb, licorice is another. And the kind of experience you get from cleaning your mouth with these herbs is much different than you would get from, say, just using a super saccharine sweet toothpaste that's got fluoride or whatever in it. And I'm not going to get into the whole issue of the fluoride debate right now, but consider the fact that people for thousands of years didn't use fluoride-containing toothpastes, and they had great oral health following these traditional practices. And one other technique that I can mention that I've had a lot of experience with and benefit in using with patients is this technique of nasya. Now, you might have heard of this technique of neti. Neti is taking a little pot that has a spout and a handle, just like a little teapot that you maybe like a little children's tea set or something. I guess you could use that in a pinch, but typically it's this dedicated vessel, and you fill it with a saline solution and you pour it into one nostril, and then it comes out the other nostril. A lot of people have had benefit and success with this, but it doesn't do much, right? The water just goes into one nostril and then out the other nostril and pulls some mucus out. I'm not going to criticize that technique unduly, but I can say that if you have a situation of chronic nasal or sinus congestion, the risk is in using neti is that you can retain some water in the nasal sinus passages after use. And unfortunately, that water becomes a factor in the development of a secondary bacterial infection. And I've seen that happen many times if you don't completely eliminate all the water. So that technique of neti and using a neti pot is a modification of an ancient yogic technique where the water is actually snuffed into the nose and then spit out the mouth. That is the correct way of doing it. But most people don't do it that way. So instead, what we practice in Ayurveda is something called nasya. And nasya is typically a medicated oil. It can be another substance, but typically a medicated oil is the most common thing that's used. And there's various different formulations that are used out there. Like there's a formula like Anu Thaila, another one is called Shadbindu Thaila. I have recipes that I've shared with my students that you can find online, different nasya or medicated oils. And just like I mentioned about the oil that you use to clean the oral cavity, it has this penetrating property. It is antimicrobial on its own. It has those same effects or benefits. And simply what you do is you just take a little container of this oil, like a little dropper, and you tilt your head back. You block one nostril, the nostril that's not receiving the oil, and you put the drops into the open nostril. And then inhale that back, sniff that back, and it takes a little bit of practice. It's a little bit unusual. Most of us aren't used to having stuff going in our nose. And you snuff it down so that oil comes down the back of your throat. And then you want to repeat it with the other side. And you're not using much oil. You're using maybe 2 or 3 drops. Not too much. We also use this therapeutically, like in a hospital inpatient setting, in which case a much larger amount of oil is used. But there is a risk of you fainting or having some other kind of temporary side effect. So if you're doing it at home, you're just using a few drops in each nostril. You snort it back all the way down the back of your throat. And as the oil comes down, it brings with it the mucus. And then you spit out that mucus. And keep doing that until the taste of the oil is gone, until the nasal passages and throat are clear of that oil. And then you can follow that with different yogic breathing or pranayama techniques. The one that I recommend is the Nadi Shodhana, Anuloma Viloma, where simply you take your thumb and you block your right nostril and you inhale through your left nostril. You block your left nostril, exhale through your right, inhale through your right, block your right, and exhale through your left. That's one cycle. And you would repeat that 6 times, take a little break, do it another 6 times, take another break, and then do another 6 times. So altogether, 18 rounds of that. And you do that after you apply the oil and you finish spitting it out, and that helps to remove any residual congestion that might be there. I'm going to Toronto tomorrow to deliver a lecture on dementia. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about is how dementia is correlated with chronic nasopharyngeal infection. So when you consider the function of the brain, there's this fluid that surrounds the brain called cerebrospinal fluid. And it contains nutrients that are flowing into the brain and also wastes that the brain is discharging into the fluid. So it's a medium of transportation in the exchange of both nutrients and wastes. Now, all that fluid, as it's flowing up and down the spine, the spinal column, around and inside the brain, all gets directed to this little shunt at the top of the nasopharynx, to what's called the cribriform plate. Special lymphatic tissues exist there that allow for the discharge of this cerebrospinal fluid that's carried by the local lymphatics in the upper nasopharyngeal region, which are then carried to be eliminated from the body. Now, it's true, though, that we often will have chronic infections in our nose, in our sinuses, and that chronic infection burdens the local lymphatic circulation and impairs its flow. So when you have a chronic nasal sinus infection, those local lymphatics are impaired, and in turn, the cerebrospinal fluid, which is being picked up and discharged by those local lymphatics, is also not being properly discharged, leaving these reactive inflammatory wastes in the brain. And when you look at a lot of brain issues like Parkinson's, like Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, they all typically begin in the olfactory region of the brain that is just adjacent on the other side of the cribriform plate in the nasopharyngeal region. So there's a strong correlation. It's an underappreciated one, that when you have chronic nasal congestion, chronic sinus congestion, it also causes cognitive issues. And you can improve that by correcting the local microbiome in the nasopharyngeal region, in part by making sure that you're eating a good diet, you're getting plenty of exercise, you're hydrating well, that you are also using this technique called Nasya to drain those local lymphatics, which allows for the cerebrospinal fluid, the metabolite-laden cerebrospinal fluid, to be properly discharged from the brain and eliminated, so you don't get this toxic buildup in the brain. So Nasya is not just a technique for dealing with the chronic sinus or nasal issue. It's very helpful for that, but it also benefits the brain, and it's an underappreciated benefit. So this technique of Nasya then is used to help to correct problems of the nose and sinus, but also to improve the function of the brain. Very helpful technique. Gosh, there's so many more things I want to talk about when it comes to the daily regimen, but we're going to run out of time today. So unfortunately, I need to wind things up for today. But we're going to continue the conversation online in the Q&A, and I'll be touching on this topic again and continuing on with this. And if you have any questions about this, make sure that you let me know. Ask them wherever you can. You can ask them on YouTube, and you can ask them just by sending me an email. I'm happy to respond. And just so you know, those of you that are listening on CJMP, if you want to watch a video of this show today, you can go to youtube.com/Todd Caldecott, and you'll find the playlist for The Whole Itself Remains, and then you can watch it there. And then if you want to be part of our subscriber community, you can join us. All you need to do is go to dogwithbotanical.com/subscribe. And it's just a really low fee of $50 a year. That's $50 USD, a little bit more in Canadian funds, although maybe not for too much longer as the economy shifts. And then you can join us after, and you can ask me any question you want about anything we covered today or anything else that you might be encountering in the world of health and wellness. Okay, so thanks so much for joining me today. I look forward to connecting with you next week. Remember, next week we're going to do an interview with Karsten Huber on healthy home building. So until then, have a great week.